Chapter 4. Sorry, it's just taking a while for me to calm down. Alright. No more failures this time round. Chapter 4. After spending 3 days with Montheron and Zar on the road to the Friendly Arms, Abdel had to admit he kind of liked the gruff halfling. The little guy was odd, to be sure. He would complain incessantly all day that the sunlight was too bright, even though the sky was overcast and dull grey most of the time. His aversion to light was sometimes silly, other times it was disturbing. Montheron seemed amused by his human companion Zar, and often teased him by tossing pebbles and twigs at the tall mage's head as they walked. Is Montheron 11 years old? Sorry, 7 years old? Oh, that's absolutely hilarious. Abdel was ready to do more than tease Zar. Abdel was beginning to think about killing him. As the halfling joked and the mage pontificated and the hours dragged on, Abdel would devise elaborate plans to murder Zar just to pass the time. Zar had a way of speaking that confused and irritated Abdel. He would rearrange and repeat words for no good reason, would remain silent when he should speak, and speak when he had nothing useful to say. The mage twitched literally all the time, and though Abdel felt sorry for the obviously disturbed man at first, eventually he couldn't think about anything but how much he wanted to slap him. He was able to ignore the twitchy mage for the first day's walk, but when they had settled into camp, Zar told him the one thing Abdel always wanted to hear. "I know," Zar told him, "who your father is." Abdel sat up straight, and Montheron, who had been chuckling happily in the darkness, went suddenly bone still. "What did you say?" Abdel asked, the only way he could think of to ask the man to continue. "Zar!" Montheron started. "Zar! Again! Your father!" the mage said to Abdel, ignoring the halfling. "Your father was..." "Enough!" Montheron said sharply, and the mage spun to lock eyes with him. "Can't you see the boy's a mite sensitive about that?" "How would you know that?" Abdel. Wait, sorry. I lost. Yeah, Abdel asked Zar, ignoring the halfling. "You don't even know me. You don't know who I am. How could you know my father?" And Montheron reached out and put a hand on Zar's forearm. The mage jerked away violently. "He should be happy," Zar said to no one in particular. "He should be happy to be the son of a god. Of a god!" And Abdel sighed. The man was insane. "I am the son of a god?" Abdel asked, anger making his voice tight and quiet. "Oh," the mage said, his voice dripping condescension. Oh yes, you most certainly are." "My friend," the halfling said to Abdel, "is obviously a madman. But he can make fire shoot from his fingertips, so I keep him around." "Shut ya!" Zar scolded. "Ya, he's the son of Baal." Abdel sighed again and lay down to go to sleep. Zar muttered to himself for a little while, his voice eventually fading into the sound of the crickets. "I buried my father," Abdel said, more for himself than for the delusional mage or the halfling. "The only father I'll ever need, the day I met you two. He was no god, and neither am I." "And what if you were?" Montron asked, his voice soft on the night's quiet breeze. Abdel looked up at him, and even in the darkness he could tell the halfling's face was set, serious. And this made Abdel laugh. "I'd wish myself 1,000 times, 1,000 pieces of gold for one," Abdel answered. This made Montron laugh. "I'd drop the Salt Coast into the sea just to see it sink, and make zombies of everyone who ever ill spoke of me." "Make me load the water deep," the halfling joked. "Aye," Abdel said, mimicking Montron's peculiar bruget. "You'll be king of the world." The two of them laughed, and when Montron finally settled down to sleep, he said, "Sometimes, lad, things are a way of surprising you." "Yes," Abdel said, yawning, "they do at that." Abdel had visited the Friendly Arms over half a dozen times in the past several years, but the sight of it always surprised him. It had been a rather well-built fortress in its day, constructed by a cult of the now dead god Baal. The story was that a band of gnomes around the place had run afoul of the cultists, and after years of fighting back and forth, the gnomes drove the Baal worshippers out. This seemed unlikely to Abdel, though, as he had met a few gnomes in his day, and found it difficult to believe that people who barely reached his knee could drive anyone out of anywhere. Is this fucking real writing? Holy shit. Wow. Nice. Alright. Abdel didn't know anything about this god Baal, but if it was true that his worshippers were driven out of such an imposing stone fortress by these tiny forest folk, well, no wonder the god didn't survive the time of troubles. Now, I don't think gnomes are forest people at all, but sure. Abdel may be a fucking one lore idiot, who knows. Zar's delusional ramblings weren't lost on Abdel either. The fact that the mage had used Baal as the focus of his fantasies about Abdel's parentage must have meant that Zar had heard the story of the origin of the Friendly Arms as well. If they had been in the Dalelands, his father might have been Elminster, or maybe he should move to Evermeet and take on Corellon Larethian as his sire. Wow, that's a... okay. The Friendly Arms was a little village as much as it was a fortress. Within the high cotton walls of grey stone was a collection of buildings devoted to any number of purposes, but all serving travellers in one way or another. Abdel and his two companions approached the front gate, and a heavy wooden drawbridge was lowered over a moat. Coming in from the south, they could see that the moat didn't make it all the way around the keep yet, and there were teams of diggers and other labourers half-heartedly wandering about. The moat was a new addition, then, and certainly more for show than for defence. The Friendly Arms never locked its gate, and everyone was welcome inside, so the likelihood of siege was hardly pressing. They passed over the drawbridge and made their way with no wasted time from the pillared entrance to one of the biggest buildings in the broad, open bailey. Even if Abdel had never been there before, the sound of revelry leaking into the early evening air would have told him that this was the inn proper. It was a long walk to the high oaken door, and as they crossed the bailey, they passed a group of gnome guards. The sight of the tiny fighters made Abdel smile. The 3 guards, each no taller than 2.5 feet, were dressed in fancy but functional ringmail. Their short swords were smaller and no doubt lighter than Abdel's dagger. One was holding a spear from which fluttered the banner of the Friendly Arms, as heraldry than advertising. The 3 little men nodded to Abdel and returned his smile, then turned their attention abruptly to the inn. My god. 2.5 feet. You gotta remember, Abdel Adrian is a big, tall guy of at least 7 feet tall, very muscular as well, and very full of himself apparently. Abdel noticed a sudden change in the tavern sounds. Montaron stopped too and held out a hand to gently block Czar. The mage twitched away and shouted, "Stop touching me!" "Shh!" the halfling warned, and the gnome guards began moving slowly toward the inn. There were pauses in the steady sounds of laughter and frivolity. Holy, what a word. That was what first alerted the guards. Then came loud cheers, a crash and breaking glass followed by a loud grunt. Montaron laughed and said, "Sounds like my kind of place." The 3 traveling companions followed the gnome guards to the door. Abdul stood behind the gnomes as one of them opened the door, and he was hit with a blast of sound from inside just a fraction of a second before the chair hit him in the face. Down the big sellsword went. Dude, I can't. This writing is so hard to read. Like, how do you read this? Like the... There are commas, but they're at the worst spots ever. Abdul stood behind the gnomes as one of them opened the door, and he was hit with the blast of sound from inside just a fraction of a second before the chair hit him in the face. Down the big sellsword went, never seeing the 3 little gnomes wade into the crowd. The guards' fists were small, but when they brought them into play at their own eye level, taller men dropped like sacks of flour. Abdul, angry, bleeding from the nose, stood up, grabbed the broken chair, and surveyed the dark room full of double-over men. He gave up hope of finding the one who threw the chair, but he gave the room an icy glare all the same. Laughter started, and Abdul turned red before he realized they weren't laughing at him, but at the man being carried out by the 3 gnomes. They were dragging the dirty, vile-smelling commoner more than carrying him, and the big man made a small sound every time his head bounced against the rough wooden planks of the floor. Abdul looked at the now unconscious man with undisguised fury as he was dragged past. Montaron grabbed the chair when he saw Abdul jerk forward. "Leave him," the halfling said. "Looks like he's paid in full." Abdul stood stock still and tried to let the anger pass, but it wouldn't. He wanted to kill someone. Montaron was looking at him curiously. Why is that playing? "See?" Czar stage whispered. The halfling pushed the mage away and pulled gently on the chair. Abdul let him take it. "You'll be needing a drink," he said, and Abdul nodded. A gnome woman climbed up on top of the bar and called to the room. "Next one throws the chair gets my fists in his danglies. This," and she paused long enough to belch resoundingly, "is a classy establishment." A cheer followed this warning, and the crowd room fell back into the general chaos of a night at the Friendly Arms. The ale was good, and after 3 pints of it, Abdul was starting to relax. He sat at the bar and kept his head down, ignoring the tussle and bluster of the ever more crowded bar-room. He had not spoken since he had been hit by the chair, and though his nose hadn't bled much, he refused to wipe the blood away. The big sellsword was quite a sight. He'd been rude and sullen enough that Montaron soon left his side, disappearing quickly into a crowd that naturally towered over the little halfling. Zar was easier to get rid of, the mage having found a dark booth in a corner in which to sit and mutter to himself. Abdel didn't do much thinking. He just sat there and drank. He wasn't one for self-pity, but it had been 9 hells of a 10-day. The thought of leaving again in the morning with the halfling and that damnable muttering mage didn't appeal to him in the slightest. His purse was light, though, and not getting any heavier. The trip to Nashkel, if he took it, would be a lean one. He decided to let Montron and Zar go on their way without him. Decided to look for some paying job here at the Friendly Arms, when he remembered why he had come here in the first place. Gorion, with his dying breath, had sent him here to look for, and Abdel couldn't remember the names.
Damn it all to the abyss,
he mumbled to himself.
What does it matter anyway?
Abdel ordered a fourth. I don't know what voice to go with Abdel, to be honest with you guys. I should go with the Batman voice from
Where's Rachel?
I think. But it might be a little bit too cringy. So I don't know. Abdel ordered a fourth pint from the pleasantly gruff gnome woman who was tending the bar. He'd paid her every time from a dwindling supply of coppers. Nah, the gnome told him when he slid another 4 copper pieces across the wet bar. This one's for the smack on the beak. Abdel nodded, accepting the woman's drink, then accepting the wet rag she held out for him. He wiped the blood off his face and allowed himself a short laugh when he realized the gnome woman hadn't gone away, but was just standing there staring at him. You should put a window in that door, he said, so I guess can see what's coming before he opens it. The gnome laughed, said, I'll pass the suggestion along, while waiting for him to finish the pint in one swallow, standing ready for a 5th pint. This time she took his copper. Well met, good sir. A richly Amnian-accented voice next to him said. Abdel turned slightly to his right and glared at the lean Amnian with a look that would give the man no illusions that his company was welcome. The Amnian flinched at the stare. You are Abdel, he said, Abdel Adrian.
Gods, Abdel breathed.
Was this the man Gorion had come to see? You are. Where is Gorion?
Dead,
Abdel said simply, then his throat caught, but he didn't cry. Who is this Adrian? You are not Abdel Adrian, the Amnian said. I am Abdel, son of Gorion, but I go by no other name. The Amnian's response to this was simply a puzzled stare. The man was obviously a half-elf, his long, thin face and ears, just barely too round to be called pointed, would have been proof enough of that, but the bright violet of his eyes was a sure sign of elven blood. Bro. The human part of him was surely Amnian. He had a large, long nose and dusky olive skin. He was dressed as if for battle, in dented armor that he was obviously uncomfortable in. He was wearing a helmet, which, considering the surroundings, seemed a wise idea. His lips curled and twitched. He was nervous. You have come here to meet me, though, the Amnian said. I am Khalid. That was it. Khalid. The last word his father spoke as his life drained from his punctured eye. Then Abdel remembered that there was another. Jah, he said. I was to meet Khalid and Jah. Jahira, yes, Khalid said, grinning ear to ear. But still nervous. She is my wife. She is here. The Amnian turned instinctively toward a table on the other side of the room, but the crowd blocked his view. Come, he said, sit with us, and tell us what befell your father. He was a great man, a hero in his own way, and he will be missed. What do you know of it? Abdul asked, bile suddenly rising to the back of his throat. His voice was full of menace.
What was he?
What was he to you? Khalid stared at Abdul as if the soul had suddenly transformed into a cobra. He was scared of Abdul, and he was not at all able to hide it. He was a friend, Khalid answered. That is all. I mean no disrespect. Abdul wanted to say something rude to the Amnian, but he couldn't. Instead, he fished in his pouch for money for a 6-pint of ale. He came out with only 3 coppers.
Ball!
He cursed loudly, stood, and threw the coppers into the crowd. A drunk somewhere muttered something mildly offensive after having been clipped on the temple by one of the hard-thrown copper coins. Abdul shot to attention. More than one man, even innocent ones, scurried off to darker corners. Sweat broke out visibly on Khalid's upper lip. Gods, what did he tell you? The Amnian said. Abdul looked down at the Amnian but said nothing. I will be happy to buy you a drink, Khalid said. Please, come with me. We don't want any more attention, do we? Abdul grunted and let himself be led through the crowd. He caught sight of Montaron for only the briefest of moments. The halfling was holding a silk purse, and Abdul was sure the little man winked at him. Abdul took a couple of deep breaths to try and calm himself, and when Khalid said, "Here she is," Abdul looked up, and his breath caught. Jahira was beautiful. Half-elf like her mate, she too must have had a human parent for mom. The two looked oddly alike, but both the elf and human sides favored Jahira the more. Her face was wide and dark, her lips full and her eyes bright, nearly the same violet as Khalid's, and they sparkled with intelligence. Her face was framed in thick hair that might have been black if she were a human, but her elven blood highlighted it with streaks of fiery copper. Even though she sat, Abdul could tell she was strong of build, rugged even. She wore the bodice of hard leather that was scratched from what might have been blade strikes. She was armored. When her eyes caught his, he saw rather than heard her grasp. When her eyes caught his, he saw rather than heard her gasp. Abdul sat without looking at the chair. He couldn't pull his eyes away from hers, and she did nothing to discourage him. Her full lips twitched like her husband's. She was nervous too, and thought Abdul would never come between a man and his wife. He couldn't help hoping that she was nervous for different reasons than Khalid was.
My God.
Why was I sent here? Abdul asked them both, though he continued to look at Jahira. My father didn't live to tell me. How did Garayan die? Jahira asked. Soul swords, Abdul said. Like me. We were ambushed on the way of the lion. I killed the man who attacked us, but not soon enough. There are forces that didn't want us to meet, Khalid said. Garayan knew that. It was... The Amnian hesitated, and Abdul thought he might be lying. It was why Garayan wanted you to come with him to meet us. My father was a monk, Abdul said. A priest, a man of letters and such. What could he have been caught up in that would set such forces against him? What are you people about? Abdul was growing angry again. He hadn't been able to blame the mercenaries for Garayan's death. Those men were just doing what he himself had done all his adult life. Someone had paid them, and it took real money to hire 5 experienced killers for wilderness ambush. There are forces, Jahira said, her voice barely audible in the crowded room, who want to bring war. A comely servant girl set down 2 pints of ale. Abdul kept his eyes on Jahira as he downed his, again in one swallow. "So what else is new?" he asked sarcastically. "I've made a living from one force or another wanting war. It's what people do." Jahira was sincerely confused by his last statement, but when she turned a questioning gaze on her husband, Abdul knew she was asking something else, something more important and more frightening to her. Khalid nodded, and Jahira turned back to Abdul. "This is different," she said, her voice even quieter, and Abdul had to strain to hear her. "This is your A glass bottle disintegrated against the back of Abdul's head, and Jahira had to flinch away from the shards of glass. Abdul didn't bother to wipe the residual wine off the back of his head or pick the glass from his black hair. He stood up and turned, and the crowd parted as if they were puppets attached to his joints. At the door, a far throw away, was the man who had been dragged out by the 3 gnome guards, the chair thrower. The big stinky man was so drunk he could barely stand. Abdul stared hard at him, and the world around him seemed to slip away into blurred, echoing inconsequence. Abdul heard only the drunk who said bluntly, "What?" The sellsword's dagger flashed across the room like a silver from a lightning bolt, and Abdul's blood rushed through his head at the heavy thunk of the wide silver blade burying itself in the drunk's chest. The force of it knocked the man over, and though he twitched once, then a second time, he was dead before his head hit the floor. Abdul smiled and let the ecstasy of the kill wash over the anger and tunnel vision. When he came out of whatever trance it was he had found himself in, it was as if the inn had plunged into pandemonium. Khalid pushed him from behind and said something like, "What have you done?" Inn patrons scattered, and serving wenches dropped their trays, spattering ale and wine over the fleeing, all stunned revelers. Strangely, the serving girls advanced on Abdul, and he thought for a moment that it might be true what they said, that the serving girls here were really golems in disguise. Abdul smiled broader still. He didn't care. "Wait!" called a familiar voice. The gnome woman at the bar let out a shrill whistle, and the serving girl stopped. Even Abdul paused as he went for the sword at his back. The voice had been Montaron's. "Thief!" the halfling called again. Montaron was kneeling over the body of the drunk and producing one purse after another from the dead man's pants. "He must have been picking pockets all night. Here's mine," Montaron said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Fortunate for you," Khalid whispered to a still uncaring Abdul. "It would have been murder otherwise." Gooseflesh whispered up the back of Abdul's arms at the sound of that word. Murder. He shook his head and approached the halfling. Khalid and Jahira followed closely. "We'd better be going," Montaron said, when Abdul was close enough that only he could hear the halfling's whisper. "Aye," Abdul said, "my dagger." Montaron smiled weakly and handed the wide blade knife to Abdul. No blood dripped from it, though Abdul didn't even remember seeing Montaron pull it out of the man's chest, let alone wipe the blood away. Even drunk, reeling from the kill, Abdul admired Montaron's finesse. How do I turn it off? Chat, please don't play the sounds while we're reading. The sellsword was only barely sober enough to realize he wouldn't find work here now, even if the drunk was a thief and he had thrown and he had thrown his last 3 coppers to the crowd. Nashkel? Abdel asked. Yes, Khalid said, his voice edged with incredulity. Yes, Nashkel. Garayan knew that was where you were planning to go? Abdel turned to look down at the Amnian, then to the halfling who was regarding Khalid with a face like a stone mask. Khalid returned the stare with a questioning glance. Zar came out of nowhere and said, 5 then? Who are they, these 2? In-patrons started making advances toward the purses now displayed against the bloody chest of the dead drunk, and Abdul let himself be both pulled and pushed out of the inn. He smiled, though he wanted to cry. For his sins, he would let himself be pulled and pushed all the way to Nashkel. Chapter 5. We won't be the only ones trying to help, Jahira told Abdel as they walked the seemingly endless miles to Nashkel. I'd say not, Monturn piped in. Jahira spun on the stout halfling, obviously not appreciating this intrusion any more than she had appreciated the numerous others from both Montaron and Zar over the last 7.5 days. Montaron only smiled at her and said, Sounds bright today, eh, girl? Abdul pretended not to see the fire of warning in the halfling's eyes. Abdul was confident that Montaron was smart enough to keep his hands off Jahira. The iron shortage, Jahira continued, trying to ignore Montaron, could well lead to war between my people and yours. Abdul stopped, and the others hesitated in the steps, but all except Jahira continued on. My people? Abdul asked. He turned to face Jahira, and it was the first time in the days since they had met at the Friendly Arms that he had looked her in the eye. Abdul, unsure of himself in many ways, was nervous around this strong, beautiful woman, and it embarrassed him. They were traveling with her husband. And... She stopped, realizing she wasn't sure where he was from. Garayan was from Candlekeep. He raised you as his son there, yes? He did, Abdul said, again embarrassed, though he didn't quite know why. Then perhaps, she started again, well, a war between Amn and Baldur's Gate for one, with Candlekeep caught in the middle. Candlekeep can take care of itself, Abdul stated simply. He turned and started walking again, but slowly, allowing Jahira to stay at his side. They were several paces behind their companions now, and Abdul surveyed the unlikely crew. Zara kept swatting at something, though there were few, if any, insects about. The mage muttered to himself constantly, though since Jahira had joined them, Abdul was distracted enough by her not to be troubled by Zar. Montaron would glance back at them from time to time, apparently feeling left out, or, for reasons known only to himself, afraid. Khalid walked purposely onward and spoke little. When he had spoken over the last 7.5 days, it was about what he called the mission. Abdul, Montaron, and Zar were headed for Nashkel to seek work guarding the iron mines there. For Jahira and Khalid, there seemed to be some more noble cause, and as much as the woman tried to turn Abdul's heart to it, he just couldn't understand the urgency. Men fight, he told her, ignoring her grunt of protest. Almn and Baldur's Gate. Almn and Tether. Tether and Tether. It's the way of things. It's the way I make a living. Jaheira sighed and said, It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be what? He asked, smiling. The way of things, or the way I make a living? And Montaron laughed in front of them. Abdel realized the halfling could hear them. This made Abdel smile. Someone is deliberately sabotaging the iron supply at Nashkel and other mines. Jaheira pressed, though. Something in her tone made it clear she'd say a little more than let it rest until at least the next day. There were still more than half a 10-day north of Nashkel. Yeah, this is the novel. This is the novel, my dudes. Montaron stopped and, smiling, turned around. And what of that, Fair Jaheira? The halfling asked. Let them salvage away, I say, and when we get there, we'll find the culprit and turn him in for a great, huge reward. Jaheira didn't even acknowledge Montaron as she passed. Reward? Abdel asked. Sure, lad, Montaron said, clapping the big sellsword on the forearm. What do you think we were walking for a 10-day and 3 for justice? Jaheira spun on the halfling and spat. What would you know of justice, thief? Montaron's eyes hardened for just a fraction of a second, and Jaheira took a step back, as if sensing the confrontation. Khalid stopped and turned, but made no move to approach. Abdel kept his eyes on the halfling. Easy, lass, Montaron said, chuckling. It's all just business, ain't it? And what business are you in, Montaron? She asked. If you're talking about those purses at the Friendly Arms, he'd said jovially, maybe you should thank me for getting the boy out of there. Getting the boy out of there? Khalid asked, his voice nearly lost the breeze in a squawking crow. Montaron looked at him and smiled. Sure. And us all. Sleep, lightning, Zar suddenly shouted. Lightning, sleep. Abdel, Montaron, Jaheira, and Khalid all looked in the direction of the babbling mage. Zar was nearly 50 yards ahead of them now, obviously oblivious to the conversation. Abdel laughed first, and Montaron, and then Khalid joined him. But a silent Jaheira was the first to march off after Zar. Thank you for that, by the way, Abdel said to Montaron. Not at all, kid, Montaron said. You'll repay me, I'm sure. They had passed through Baragos on their way from the Friendly Arms. Even slept in real beds at an inn Montaron insisted on paying for. Their stay there seemed all too short, even for Abdel, who was used to sleeping under the stars as inside. And it was a relief for all of them, and they finally entered the mining town of Nashkel. Abdel didn't know if it was good luck or bad that there seemed to be some kind of festival going on in a fallow field outside town. On their way south he had heard nothing but bad news from Jaheira and Khalid, even from Montaron, that made him think Nashkel would have been some kind of ghost town by the time they got there. The image he had formed of it in his mind had been one of desperate miners begging on the streets, shops and other businesses closed, families loading cars to head for greener pastures, and the sort of morose drunkenness he had seen in too many Salt Coast taverns. Instead, the small town was alive with color. Carts were set up in every available space, and traveling merchants were showing their wares. Three men in party-colored clothes were juggling flaming torches. A gnome was playing a rousing tune on what looked like a cross between bagpipes and a caravan wagon. Healthy children were running everywhere, apparently no worse for wear. There were soldiers in the street, dressed in the colors of arms. Montaron nudged Abdel and drew the sellsword's attention to a small group of young women the halfling apparently found attractive. "I like to investigate their minds, eh, kid?" The halfling joked, then nearly doubled over laughing. Abdel was pretty sure he knew what the little half-thief meant, but he didn't reply. Jahira grunted and said to the halfling, "When this town is overrun by soldiers, women like that will be very busy." "Women like that are always busy," said Montaron. "Besides, not many more Amnian soldiers will waste their time here." "You sound like you'd be happy to see them march north, halfling," Jahira said. "Maybe you already know what is wrong here." You sound like you'd be happy to see. Oh yeah. Montaron laughed. By the sound had an edge to it that Abdel had been hearing more and more often in the last 13 days. "I know nothing, girl," Montaron told her. "Less even than ye, if all this talk of war is true." "Someone wants blood to spill in Baldur's Gate and Armen," Jahira said. "That I know." "And what if it's an Amnian wanting, girl?" Montaron asked, a crafty look curling the side of his mouth. "Will you be so dead set to stop it then?" Jahira inhaled sharply and was about to say something when she stopped abruptly and turned on Abdel. He was trying not to laugh, and it showed. "This is very serious," she said. Abdel smiled and nodded. "We should find an inn," Khalid said, purposely breaking into the deteriorating conversation. "We can get a good night's sleep and head to the mines in the morning." Jahira nodded and followed him into a crowd of festival goers. Abdel watched her walk away, and Montaron noticed him noticing her. The halfling disappeared into the crowd. "We will go, son of Baal," Zar said, staring at Abdel. The sellsword turned on the wiry maid and said, "Go with Khalid, mage." Zar hesitated, and Abdel reached for his arm. "Touch me!" Zar shrieked. "Don't touch me!" 24 or more people stopped what they were doing and turned to look at Abdel, though it was Zar who was obviously insane. Abdel sighed, trying to breathe out his desire to kill the twitching mage, then just walked away. Abdel knew where they all went, but he didn't go with them to the inn. He had walked and traveled with others before, some of whom he liked and some of whom he didn't. He had traveled with women before, but none who moved him like Jahira. He had met 1,000 men like Khalid. He reckoned quiet, serious types on a mission. Montaron, halfling or otherwise, was a dime a dozen on the Salt Coast, a crafty survivor who knew what was in every pocket and behind every locked door, and would know eventually. Zar was a puzzle. He had met madmen before, too, he figured, but this one was mad and highly intelligent at the same time, delusional and capable of wielding magic. He wandered the festival grounds and wondered what he was doing there. He had followed 2 chance-met strangers, No, 4 chance met strangers on a mission he didn't even understand, and clearly wasn't going to be paid for. Monteron seemed to be able to steal enough to keep them at inns and buy an ale or two, but that was not the way Abdel wanted to see the world. He was capable of working for his keep, and he wanted to do just that. Still, there was this problem in the mines. At first, the festival did a good job of masking the problems that were becoming more obvious to Abdel as he walked on. There were merchant carts, sure, and the people of Nashkel were stopping to look, but almost no one was buying. The men looked nervous and the women serious. They're pouring ale, Montran said from behind Abdel. Are you with me? Abdel turned, as amused as he was amazed at the halfling's ability to appear and disappear at will in crowds. Abdel would never understand what it was like to be 2 feet shorter than everyone around him. His problem was just the opposite. There is something wrong, isn't there? Abdel asked. If you mean with the iron mines, Monterman answered, aye. So where is our employer? Who pays us to protect those miners? Monterman smiled and shrugged. We'll go to the mines tomorrow and find out. In the meantime, here's a bit of coin while us away this festival a bit, and join me at the inn for an ale or 7. The halfling said, produced a leather pouch, and gave him the coin from his pocket. I can't take that money. It's been feeding ye since the friendly arms, Montheron reminded him, not expecting Abdel to feel guilty. Take it and see what you can find for the common good. The halfling nodded at a particular merchant's cart, laughed and disappeared into the crowd once more. Abdel studied the cart and its proprietor. The man was dressed like a Kalashite, but his features were decidedly northern. He had been from Waterdeep, maybe Luskan, Abdel guessed, and was selling a collection of glass and silver vials. Perfumes, maybe? The merchant noticed Abdel looking at him and spread a huge gap-toothed grin across his face in a practiced greeting. Potions, the man called, his accent proving Abdel right about his northern heritage. Elixirs, draughts, and ointments for every ill and every eventuality. Abdel approached, the little purse still in his hand, jiggling with the weight of coin. Aye, my good sir, the merchant said. I see you have a need. Abdel was legitimately confused by this and said, Indeed? And what need have I? The merchant laughed. You fight, he said, and looked Abdel up and down appreciatively, and fight well to be sure. You will guard yourself well, but still fall victim to the lazy stab or slash here and there, I'm sure. 1 sip of this. He lifted a plain silver vial from the collection spread across his cart. You'll be feeling no pain. 4 coppers and ale will do the same. Aye, the merchant said, his smile not faltering for a moment. Ah, yes, indeed, sir, but in the morning the cut is still there, treated only with the ale, that is. But this beauty will make it all go away. The secret is lost to the ages, but it can be yours for a price. The secret or the draught? Ah, the draught, of course, sir, the merchant said, then glanced at the little pouch in Abdel's big hand. Unless you have a bigger purse elsewhere? Abdel laughed and came closer still. He asked about some of the other vials and heard tales no sane man would believe. There was something about this act of haggling with some over-cheerful merchant that settled Abdel. He had been as taut of nerve the last 10 days and a half, and he had been than he had been ever in his life. Everything had changed abruptly, but still seemed to be moving so slowly. Acid. Abdul asked, not understanding the word. "Aye, good Salsal, aye," the merchant said. "This is a dangerous concoction indeed. Like liquid fire it burns. A creation of the mad geniuses of Netheril. For sale today, for what an honest man such as yourself can afford." Exactly what an honest man could afford ended up being a matter of some debate, and it was nearly an hour before Abdul walked back into the crowd with the smaller leather pouch now containing a small silver vial, a slightly larger glass one, and 4 coppers. "Oh, please, girl," Montaran whined. "I ain't gonna poison ye for old Gorlonion's sake." It's chapter 6, by the way, folks. Jahira only gruntled in response, but Khalid reached for the wineskin the halfling was offering. He held it gingerly to his nose, as if it might explode. The Amnian sniffed, then shrugged his head and said, "Smells like ale." "And ale it is, my friend," Montaran said. "Go ahead, for luck's sake." Khalid smiled and looked at both Azar and Abdul. The mage and the Soul had each downed sizable quaffs of Montaran's special ale, and both were still standing, none the worse for wear. "Oh, you got odds, Jodpanth? I'm sorry, my dude." "Khalid," Jahira started to say, but stopped when Khalid lifted the skin to his lips and drank. He held the liquid in his mouth for a second or two before swallowing, then closed his eyes as it slid down. When he opened them again, he said, "Go ahead, Jahira, make the halfling happy. Maybe there is something to rituals like these." "We're going into Ogma knows where, girl," Montaran added, "and a little luck won't hurt ye." "Lucky ale," Jahira scoffed, but took the skin and drank from it quickly, just wanting to get over with it. "Can we go now?" Abdul asked, itching around the collar of his chainmail tunic. They had been walking all morning from Nashkel and hadn't made it to the mines yet. Montaran stopped them where a thin strip of brown mud led off from the main path. He claimed it was a shortcut, and that it would get them to the mines in no time. Drinking lucky ale was a silly ritual he claimed to have observed whenever his path led towards danger. Abdul drank right after Zar, giving it no second thought. He had seen stranger good luck charms in his day. Now he was just anxious to get on to the mines. Jahira gave the halfling his wineskin back, and the 5 of them headed down the path. The coarse grass that bordered the main path gave way to a deep field of black wild flowers. The field was solid with them, and though Abdul never noticed things like flowers, there was something about these that struck him as strange. They were all so alike, and there were so many of them, and there was something about them that just seemed out of place. "Follow me very carefully, all," Montaran said, his voice low and serious. "For luck," Jahira teased. "Or are you afraid of damaging the pretty flowers?" Abdul leaned down to pick one. He meant to give it to Jahira, even imagined gently sliding it behind one of her slim, pointed ears, brushing back her jet-black hair and "This is your garden," Khalid said, breaking into Abdul's thoughts and making him stop. "Isn't it, Montaran?" Abdul flushed and straightened, embarrassed, but no one saw. There are dangers all about, my Amnian friend, Montaron replied. Even in the field of pretty black flowers, though they might be a little tempting in the dark. The halfling was silent for a moment, walking carefully, with his eyes glued to the ground in front of him. He was leading them through the field of flowers in a twisting, nonsensical path. The uniformity of the patch of flowers, the color, and the sighing of the breeze through them had a calming effect on all 5 of them. Abdul forgot his embarrassment. Zahar didn't sweat an unseen bugs or talk to himself, and Khalid and Jahira even followed the halfling, saying nothing. "Damn, son," Montaron said, breaking the silence. Abdul looked up and saw for the first time that an old, dilapidated farmhouse stood in the center of the field of black flowers. It was a simple structure, paneled in wood, that still showed the splintered grade of what was once a bright coat of whitewash. The roof sagged and moss grew on it. The shutters had come off the windows, maybe years ago, leaving only shadows in the whitewash to walk. Fucking, I fucking swear, reading this is just a nightmare. Who writes like this? I've read books in English before, and it is absolutely insane. There are no commas anywhere. Like, you have to know the text before you read it. It's... Whew. The roof sagged and moss grew on it. The shutters had come off the windows maybe years ago, leaving only shadows in the whitewash to mark that they had been there at all. The windows were just squares of black. Abdul sighed at the sight of the house. A family's house, he thought. A family once lived there. "Guards," Montaron explained and drew up short. The others stopped. Jahira actually bumped into Abdul's back, and he flinched away from the contact. When he looked back to say something to the woman, he met her husband's eyes instead. Khalid smirked, then looked away, and Abdul flushed again. "What is it?" the sellsword asked Montaron, hoping to cover his embarrassment. "A body," Zara said simply. "A body that is dead." Abdul squinted and stepped forward, crushing a couple of the flowers. Montaron flinched when he saw that, and Abdul ignored the halfling, who stared at him for the next several minutes as if expecting some change to come over him. Abdul looked down at the body at Montaron's feet. The man had been dead for days, but there was still very little decay. There were no flies, which was what Abdul thought most peculiar. A body laying dead in the open for days tended to attract flies. The dead man was human, dressed in the simple ring mail of an inexperienced mercenary or a common foot soldier. The man's eyes were white, going to great green. His tongue was sticking out, swollen and black. There was no blood or obvious wounds. I sound more and more confused. I do. I do sound more and more confused. Like, this is so hard to read. I have read books in English in the past, and it was fine, but this is very, very, very hard to read. Like, you can tell this is a draft. What killed this man? Abdul asked, not really expecting an answer. Poison, yes? Zar offered, avoiding eye contact with Abdul as always. Abdul nodded, seeing the truth in it. Montaron knelt over the man and started running his hands along the dead soldier's belt. "Montaron!" Jahira gasped. "Leave him in peace, can't you?" "She's right, Montaron," Abdel said. Leave him. Montaron ignored them, standing and turning around only when he had found something. Keys? Abdel asked, when he saw what the halfling was holding in his hands. There was a whole set of them, half a dozen big brass keys on a simple iron ring. If you can find out where this man lived, Khalid said, sneering, you'll be a rich man for sure, thief. Montaron smiled and looked over his shoulder at the collapsing farmhouse. Close enough, he said. A chill ran down Abdul's spine at the thought of the thief gobbling up what memories might be left in that perfect house. The house he should have grown up in. The sellsword shook his head, trying to shake these odd, weak, melancholy thoughts loose. He caught Zar's eye and returned the mage's knowing smirk with a curl of his lip. Abdul snatched the keys violently from Montaron's grip and squeezed them in his big, calloused hand until he thought they might puncture his skin. Leave it, Abdul said. End him. We started this trip by heading for the mines, and now we're going to get to those mines. Abdul turned and walked on, and Montaron let the sellsword lead the way, only as long as it took for him to exchange a long knowing glance with Zar. The mage nodded and followed. Abdul had never been in a mine before, but this one was much as he had expected. The tunnel was simple, square with a low ceiling held up at intervals of 15 or 20 feet by large wooden supports. The walls were rough, cut into solid rock from the entrance in the side of a deep mine pit. The mining complex was only a couple hours' walk from the fields of black flowers. When they had emerged from Montaron's shortcut path, they had stumbled into a group of tired-looking miners heading back toward Nashville with picks and shovels, but no cart of ore. The miners gave them only a passing glance, and Abdel's odd little party made their way against a flow of dirty, obviously unhappy men to the edge of the pit. A group of Amnian soldiers didn't so much guard as hang around the oh my fucking god, this is writing. Okay. A group of Amnian soldiers didn't so much guard as hang around the steps leading into the mine. A big, sooty, dark-skinned man looked to be in charge of the place. He scowled at the soldiers with obvious irritation, and the youthful Omnian sergeant tried not to notice. There is definitely something wrong here, Abdel said later, his voice echoing in the mine tunnel. Aye, kid, Montaron, equally resonant voice answered from the gloom behind him. And that be big fat Emerson's fella be willing to pay a stop to it. When they had first arrived at the pit, Emerson, the mine boss, had reached into an ore cart and produced a fist-sized lump of grey-brown rock. He squeezed it, and it crumbled to dust. The boss cursed loudly and threw the handful of worthless iron dust to the dry ground where it mixed with more of the same. He turned his back on the cart and walked away. The miners who had been standing around the cart looked no happier than the foreman, but their faces were also tainted by the unmistakable look of panic. That dust was once their sole livelihood. He doesn't have to pay us for our help, Jahira said. The mine means life to those people. Aye, lass, Montaron chuckled, and there are few things as expensive as life. Emerson had eyed them carefully, making note of their features and dress before he let them into the mine tunnel. The workers had been clearing out over the last several hours, and Emerson had little hope that this hole in the ground, which was once the lifeblood of Nashkel, would ever be mined again. "You're a true humanitarian, Montaron," Khalid said sarcastically, only Montaron laughed at the comment. "They'll live," the halfling said, his voice as confident as it was disappointed. "This way," Zar said, louder than Abdel had ever heard him say anything. "This way, yes, this way." Montaron nodded and made to follow Zar. Abdel took one step to follow them both, but a light touch from Jahira stopped him. Abdel was secretly happy not to have flinched. "Why this way?" she asked. "Why this way?" she asked, glancing meaningfully down the other passage that formed the Y intersection at which they stood. "No reason," Montaron said and shrugged. "One's way as good as any, no?" "This way," Zar said, "for sure." Montaron sighed and looked at his friend. The mage nodded furiously and said, "This way, Montaron, yes?" "As good as any?" Jahira asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "How do you know the tunnels?" Khalid asked, taking a threatening step forward. Abdul looked at Montaron, curious to hear the answer. "My friend here is a mage," the halfling offered, "and as such is sensitive to this kind of thing, eh?" "What kind of thing?" Jahira asked. "Poisoning iron mines?" "Poisoning iron?" Abdul had to ask. How could such a silly thing be done? "Ask your little friend here," Khalid accused. "If you'd like to go down the other passage so badly, Amnian," Montaron said, trying with an obvious difficulty to remain civil. "Let us go, but not before we ask why you're so set to go that way." Jahira said, "Accuse us. Go ahead. Accuse Arm. This mine supplied Arm as well as Baldur's Gate. I think we all know who's who here, halfling." Montaron smiled and nodded. "I'm glad in the idea, young missus." "This is none of my concern," Abdul said, "and surely of no interest to Garayan, who was no miner or ironmonger or blacksmith. Why are we here at all?" Surjat. "To stop a war," Jahira told Abdul, though her eyes never left the halfling. Montaron turned and walked several steps down the darkening tunnel with Zar in tow. "Bring back the proof," he said, his voice echoing loudly in the confined space, "and there'll be reward enough in both Baldur's Gate and Arm." Zar muttered something, and a small spot of yellow light appeared above his head, following him as he strode swiftly down the passage. Abdul sighed, watching them walk away, their light making them stand out brightly against the darkness. He waited until Montaron turned to see if they were following before he followed. Jahira and Khalid made no secret that they came along only under duress. It didn't take more than a minute for Abdul to catch up. He was almost in reach of them both when Zar abruptly stopped. The mage bent at the waist, and the ball of light followed him down, staying only inches over the top of his head the whole way. The flash of reflected light drew Abdul's attention to a small silver vial on the tunnel floor. Zar took it between thumb and index finger and picked it up slowly, gingerly, as if he were lifting a dead mouse from a trap. "Amnian," Zar said, holding the vial out to Abdel. "Yes?" "There it is," Montaron said. "The proof. Just sitting there on the floor for any fool. No offense, Tsar, to see. Amnian make for certain. What is this? Jahira asked harshly. Amnian, Tsar said, shaking and bringing his hands up. Nithrik Gala, the mage started to mumble. Abdul grabbed the mage's hands and said, "Stop it, Tsar!" so loudly, Montaran and Jahira both covered their ears. The mage looked at Abdel with fiery anger in his eyes and shrieked, "Don't touch me!" Montaran drew his sword, and Abdel let the mage's hands fall away and grabbed for his own sword. By the time the big, wide blade came out of its sheath, Abdul could see that the halfling had drawn not on him, but on Jahira and Khalid. Even before Abdul could make sense of the situation, all four of them were armed, and Tsar seemed ready enough to begin another casting. "Amnian treachery!" Montran spat, and even Abdul could see the halfling was overselling the point. "Yes, the vial, Abdul, just like the one you bought from the vendor in Nash." And the halfling stopped abruptly and looked at Abdul. "What vial I bought in Nashkel?" Abdul asked, his fingers tightening on the hilt of the sword. Tsar twitched, and his hand came up. Abdul reacted fast, but maybe it was something in the unnatural magic light, or the gradual downward slope of the passageway, or the still dusty air, but he wasn't fast enough. Khalid was coming in with his sword, and just by instinct Abdul batted the blade away and sliced back. He felt his blade sink into the Amnian's midsection, and there was an echoing cry that might have been either Khalid or Jahira, or maybe both. Tsar mumbled something, and Abdul distinctively heard Montaran say, "No!" Blood splashed in Abdul's face, and he closed his eyes for just a second. His timing was fortunate because at that exact moment Tsar's magical light grew brighter, and Jahira and Montaran both cursed. Abdul felt Khalid fall. His broadsword was still stuck in the Amnian's side. Abdul let the sword fall, but kept his left hand on it. He reached for his dagger with his right hand, but before he came fully out of the sheath, he was struck between the legs by something small, hard, and moving fast. The air burst from his lungs, and he stumbled backwards. His hand came off the dagger, and he heard the clatter of metal on stone. He didn't wait for the echoes to fade before he put his right hand back on his big broadsword and pulled it out of the fallen Amnian. "After her!" Montaran screamed, and Abdul, blinking to clear his vision from the blood, and the blow to the groin followed. As the footsteps of the halfling and the big sellsword faded into the echoing distance of the dark mine, Tsar bent and retrieved the heavy silver dagger. He took a moment to admire the engraving and didn't give chase. He turned in the direction of the entrance and slipped the dagger in his big leather pouch. "Yes," the mage muttered to himself. "Yes, so far, yes." And that's the end of chapter 6. Thank you very much for listening. I hope everyone has a good night. And holy moly, this is very hard to read, chat. Very, very hard to read. Good night, everyone. Hope you have a good one. Peace.